In the many thousands of years since humans domesticated dogs, we have bred them to an astounding number of shapes and sizes and colors and personality traits. The world's record smallest dog is just under 4 inches tall, whereas the world's record tallest dog is just under 4 feet. The International Federation of Kennel Clubs recognizes some 360 dog breeds, and as every dog owner will tell you, every dog breed is different, as is every dog. Yet some breeds are particularly recognizable and have found a particular place in history. For more than a century and a half, one breed has been associated with the noble profession of firefighting. It is history that deserves to be remembered. There is a great degree of disagreement among scientists over exactly how far back humans domesticated dogs. While the common thinking used to be that domestication occurred about 14,000 years ago, the website of the nonprofit Morris Animal Foundation explains that, based on recent genetic studies, some researchers believe dogs might have commingled with humans as early as 130,000 years ago, long before our human ancestors settled into agricultural communities. There is compelling archaeological evidence that domestication occurred at least tens of thousands of years ago. The website of pharmaceutical company Boehringer Ingelheim points to a burial site in the Czech Republic, where the remains of a dog were buried with a bone, possibly a mammoth bone, carefully placed in its mouth after death, dated to some 31,000 years ago. Notably, the magazine Archaeology explained in 2012, the skulls of the animals at the site, called piedmosti, had most of the distinctive traits that separate domesticated dogs from their wolf ancestors, including a shorter, broader snout and a wider brain case. Not only does this represent compelling physical evidence that the domestication of dogs goes back tens of thousands of years, but it also provides evidence that humans were, via selective breeding, changing those dogs. This leads to a further question. How far back did humans create specific breeds? There's been an issue of scientific inquiry, and the website A to Z Animals notes that genetic evidence suggests that the Greenland sled dog breed might be the oldest domestic dog breed. Might have been around as long as 9,500 years. But genetic studies have not been able to pinpoint the origin of some breeds, notably the Dalmatian. The American Kennel Club explains, but when it comes to Dalmatians, all that scientific evidence comes to a screeching halt. Though genetically they are grouped among retrievers, Dalmatians don't line up strongly with any established modern breeds. Might be that they're really cats, one researcher quipped. That is, we really don't know how old the breed is or where it came from. While some authors confidently assert that the breed was developed in Dalmatia, a province that is today in Croatia, but which dates back to an Illyrian tribe of classical antiquity, the American Kennel Club describes this explanation as probably most unlikely, arguing that the breed certainly did not originate there. The website of Vancouver breeder Highgate Dalmatians cites multiple researchers who failed to find evidence that the breed existed in Croatia prior to the 1930s. Rather, most sources simply say that the origin of the breed is murky. The American Kennel Club notes that the distinctively spotted dogs have been documented across cultures and continents, not to mention millennia, as far back as 3700 BC. Egypt's King Cheops, who built the Great Pyramid, was said to have owned one. Some 2,000 years later, Greek frescoes depicted both black and brown spotted dogs, their dotted coats meticulously painted, chasing a boar. Thus, Dalmatians are assumed to be a very old breed, so old that they cannot be easily genetically tied to modern breeds. The Dalmatian Club of America notes, no breed has a more interesting background or a more disputed heritage than the dog from long ago, the Dalmatian. His beginning is buried so deep in the past that researchers cannot agree as to his origin. As to the great age of the breed and the fact that it has come through many centuries unchanged, investigators are in complete agreement. How old might the breed be? The American Kennel Club notes some canine historians point to records of a 400 BC breeding between a Cretan hound and a Bahaka dog, or white antelope dog, a likely reference to its color and swiftness. That cross resulted in offspring that hunted deer and worked so well with horses that they were naturally inclined to run alongside them. This explains why the breed has long been associated with the Romani people, who are an itinerant people who historically traveled by wagon. The website of National Purebred Dog Day, which is May 1st, if you were wondering, explains Dalmatians were frequently found in bands of Romanis that treasured the dogs for their flashy markings and enthusiasm for fun. These were traveling people who carried their possessions in horse-drawn wagons and as such covered miles and miles. It makes sense that a dog with an affinity for horses and the stamina to run alongside them would be part of that culture. But this connection doesn't necessarily answer the question of the provenance of the dog breed, as the origin of the Romani is itself opaque. As a website from the University of Graz, Austria, explains, they did not write chronicles of their history, nor did they have bards who through oral accounts would keep people from forgetting noteworthy stories. While linguistic and genetic analysis suggest an Indian origin for the Romani, that again does not answer the question of the dog breed, since the Roma people have followed complex migration routes across the world. What it does do is illustrate some of the unique characteristics of the breed, especially their agility, stamina, purported affinity for horses, and proficiency in accompanying wagons. And it possibly explains how the breed found a new place, as National Purebred Dog Day explains. As Dalmatians traveled throughout Europe and Asia, they eventually arrived in Europe, perhaps in the late 18th century. It's likely that this is how the British upper class found the dogs and brought them home. It was here that the breed found specific fame as carriage dogs. The American Kennel Club explains that in the days before automobiles, those who could afford to travel did so by horse-drawn coach. The Dalmatian was a breed well suited to accompany these carriages, as the Dalmatian Club of America writes. He is physically fitted for road work in his makeup. Speed and endurance are blended to a nicety. His gait has beauty of motion and swiftness, and he has the strength, vitality, and fortitude to keep going gaily till the journey's end. The instinct for coaching is bred in him, born in him, and trained in him through the years. The Dalmatian takes to a horse as a horse takes to him, and that is to say, like a duck to water. The American Kennel Club describes the value of such animals. Carriage dogs run alongside carriages, and horseback riders protect them from their many threats on the road, especially highwaymen. Dalmatians, with their speed, endurance, watchfulness, and coaching instinct, were a natural choice, as they were exceptionally well suited to road work and could keep up with the horses without difficulty. When trouble showed up, these dogs alerted human security, and their size and protective instincts made them a deterrent in their own right. And while the era of the fancy carriage was limited, eventually those same characteristics that made them such good carriage dogs would find a new use. As fire departments began to use horse-drawn apparatus in the mid-19th century, Dalmatians became a natural breed to accompany them. The American Kennel Club quotes Cheryl F. Steinmetz, the historian for the Dalmatian Club of America. Back then, the fire equipment was horse-drawn, and the dogs came in as guards to clear the way in front of the house. When the horses left, they stayed. The website of the Brentwood, Tennessee Fire Department writes, as the fire service evolved from hand-drawn to horse-drawn fire apparatus, the evolution of the Dalmatian's role was a natural one as well. The dogs would keep the horses company in the fire barn during long stretches of inactivity and then spring to action along with their equestrian counterparts when the fire bell rang. Just as they had for centuries, the dogs would run alongside the horses as they responded to the call for help. The website Live Science explains their role at the fire. The brave, loyal dogs also served an important purpose once the wagon approached a fire. Horses are afraid of fire, and the Dalmatian's presence could distract and comfort the horses as they pulled the wagon closer to a blaze. The Dalmatians also stood guard near the wagon to ensure that no one stole the firefighters' belongings, equipment, or horses. But it's honestly not really clear how ubiquitous Dalmatians were as fire dogs in the era of horse-drawn apparatus. Actually, a few pictures from the era show dogs running with the horses, and certainly other dog breeds were also used in firehouses. The image of the Dalmatian run alongside the fire horses might be overstated and might be particularly driven by the Fire Department of New York, which started using Dalmatians as fire dogs in the 1870s. But the connection was still strong in the public mind. In 1910, the prestigious Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show created a category for fire dog Dalmatians. A Dal named Mike from New York's Engine Company No. 8 on 51st Street won in the first year. For his victory, the famous Dal was given a free pass to ride on New York City trolleys. That same year, the website Ephemeral New York writes, a new motorized fire engine in the city drew a crowd. The era of horse-drawn fire apparatus lasted only about a half-century. But in that time, an article in a 1905 issue of Field and Fancy magazine, written by Dalmatian Club of America Vice President Harry T. Peters, writes, the firemen have done more to keep the Dalmatian from dying out during its eclipse from fashion than the stablemen. The firemen speak in high terms of the courage and fidelity of the spotted dogs. After the era of coach dogs, and even as fire departments became motorized, when the breed fell out of fancy, it was the association with firefighters which kept the breed popular. And the connection continued, even when the skills of a coach dog no longer applied. Live Science writes, you would think that with the invention of the automobile, Dalmatians would no longer be needed by firemen. Some firehouses, however, have kept the dogs around as friendly companions in order to preserve the tradition. Dalmatians continue to guard firefighters' possessions, but instead of running alongside the fire trucks, they ride inside of them. The dogs are also known to catch and kill rats that have taken up residence in firehouses. Fire dogs, more often than not Dalmatians, have continued to serve as guardians, companions, and public symbols. A 2021 article in the Columbus, Ohio Dispatch mentions a Dalmatian dog named Sparks, acquired by the Marysville Fire Department in 1969. He's afraid of two things, the newspaper wrote: fire hats and the firehouse basement door. The website of the Paterson, New Jersey Fire Department writes that a 1941 Paterson News story on Department Dog said that truck number 3 has an 18-month-old Dalmatian called Smokey. Fritz is a Dal at engine number 4 and has had his own badge attached to his collar. Engine 3 has 3-month-old pups called Chief and Mate, and Engine 6 has a 14-month-old Buttons. The website notes a particularly famous Dal named Cindy, who was given to the men of Engine Company 3 on the 12th Avenue in 1956. In her early years with the company, she had her own seat on the apparatus and often entered buildings with the firemen. But during her first pregnancy, she became too heavy and then retired from active firefighting to house watchman. She developed a habit of gathering the men's scattered shoes and placing them at the rear of the firehouse after the apparatus left the quarters. Legend has it that she was not particularly fond of chief officers or priests. There's also a story when a stranger was held captive in the firehouse for a number of hours until firemen returned from a call and rescued him. The tradition continues. A Dalmatian named Molly, a fire service dog from Johnson County, Arkansas's Rural Fire Department Station No. 1, has become the face of a fire safety program that is credited with saving the lives of 7 children and 2 adults. Molly has 105,000 followers on Facebook. Perhaps there's no clearer symbol of the connection between firefighters and Dalmatians than 20, who was the mascot of the Fire Department of New York's Ladder 20 fire station. When the company lost 7 members in the Twin Towers on 9/11, they were presented with a Dalmatian puppy named 20 by 2 members of the Monroe County Sheriff's Department in honor of the fallen firefighters. The New York Times writes that 20 immediately loved the fire truck, a classic Seagrave hook and ladder, and began accompanying the firefighters on all their calls, from raging blazes to false alarms. For 10 years, she never missed a run, said Mike Toll, who has been a senior chauffeur at Ladder 20 and often drove the truck. The dog also went with the firefighters to events held for fallen members and provided sorely needed moments of cheer and humor on a daily basis. 20 passed away in January 2016. The New York Times headline read, "Firehouse loses a spotted symbol of healing." Lieutenant Gary Ioro, who worked at Ladder 20 for 10 years, perhaps summed up the century-long connection between firefighters and their Dals when he told the Times, "I've been through a lot of stuff, and here I'm crying over a dog. But you couldn't help it. She was part of the place." Given the topic of the episode, I suppose that I'm obligated to talk about the 1961 Disney movie and the more recent remakes. Those are based on a 1956 novel by British author Dodie Smith, who herself raised Dalmatians. Smith says that the inspiration for the novel came when one of her friends saw her 9 Dalmatians and said, "Those dogs would make wonderful coats." I guess that means that there is at least some sort of a real version of Cruella de Vil. The same characteristics that made Dalmatians great coach dogs can make them somewhat difficult as pets. The American Kennel Club explains that the living, breathing animal is high energy, requires an outlet for its enthusiasm, and an owner that is willing to set clear boundaries. But they also mention that it is the breed's lively and intelligent character that has sustained it for millennia. The image of a St. Bernard today probably calls to mind the large, friendly face of a truly massive, long-haired breed of dog that has a historical reputation for saving lives. Yes, we all know St. Bernards went out into the freezing snow carrying a barrel of life-saving medication to help people who had been stranded in avalanches. And that reputation is real. They really were life-saving dogs, but it might surprise you to find out that the dogs that saved those lives looked very little like the modern breed that we call St. Bernards. And the reputation of St. Bernards owes a lot to a single animal who has been called the most famous St. Bernard that ever lived. Despite being born 221 years ago, Barry, the St. Bernard, is still considered by many to be the best of dogs, and he deserves to be remembered. The St. Bernard breed originated in the Western Alps of Italy and Switzerland. Exactly what its distant ancestors were is something of a mystery. The breed is often recognized as a Molosser dog, a broad group of dog breeds said to trace their origins back to the ancient Molossus, a kind of dog kept by the Molossians, a tribe of ancient Greece. The Molossus dog was famed in antiquity for their impressive size and ferocity and were often mentioned by ancient writers. However, there's little evidence that the St. Bernard actually descends from these dogs, possibly descended from local Mastiff types or something else. The earliest records of the St. Bernard come from the Great St. Bernard Hospice, which sits near a high pass on the border of Italy and Switzerland. The hospice was founded by Bernard of Menthon, born around 1020 and canonized as a saint in 1681. Bernard was Archdeacon of Aosta, which sat in the Aosta Valley on one end of the extremely ancient mountain pass, now known as the Great St. Bernard Pass. There's evidence that the pass was used as far back as the Bronze Age, over 3,000 years ago, and also contains remnants of a Roman road. The pass connects the Aosta Valley in Italy to the Valais canton of Switzerland. The summit of the pass is at 2,469 meters, or 8,100 feet, making it the third highest road pass in Switzerland. It passes between the two highest mountains in the Alps, Mont Blanc and Mont Rosa. The pass was often covered by many feet of snow, with drips approaching heights of 40 feet, and it was especially dangerous in the spring due to the risk of avalanches. But still, the pass was a popular route for French and German pilgrims on their way to Rome. Around 1049 or 1050, Bernard founded a canonry and hostel at the highest point of the pass. He eventually also founded another hostel at the lower Little St. Bernard Pass 30 kilometers away on the modern Italian-French border. The hospice that he founded in the Great Pass was not the first to be built there. 200 years earlier, there was one built nearby that seems to have been destroyed by Saracen incursions around the year 940. He dedicated the hospice to St. Nicholas, and it was placed under the authority of the Bishop of Sion, the Count of Valais, which is why today the pass is in Switzerland, and not Italy. The first certain reference to the dogs at the hospice appears in 1703, but the dogs are believed to have arrived somewhere between 1660 and 1670, probably given to the monks by local families. The 1703 source mentions that the cook built an exercise wheel for a dog that could spin a cooking spit. Two paintings from the 1690s also depict the dogs and describe them as cowherds' dogs. In 1707, the archive says that the hospice lost a dog in an avalanche. Their original purpose was probably to serve as guard dogs for the monastery, but they proved themselves adept at a different job, saving the lives of people trapped in avalanches or the frigid cold of the high pass. The dogs that the hospice obtained in the 17th century differed markedly from the St. Bernard of today. They were smaller, although still quite large, had a different shaped head, shorter fur, and a longer tail compared to the modern breed. The dogs were reportedly not trained by the monks, but performed their work essentially by instinct, although later reports do describe training the young dogs. Supposedly older dogs were the primary teachers to the younger dogs on how to find people in the often treacherous weather and terrain of the pass. By 1750, the dogs were often accompanied by an alpine guide called a marinier, whose job was to guide travelers through the passes. Monks themselves sometimes performed this role or assisted others, even physically carrying travelers to the convent. The guides' jobs were so important that the Kingdom of Savoy dubbed them snow soldiers and made them exempt from serving in the country's military. One traveler recorded that often the guides are obliged to use a kind of violence towards travelers who, numbed by the cold and exhausted by fatigue, urged that they be allowed to rest or sleep for a while in the snow. We must shake them, tear them by force from this treacherous sleep, which would infallibly lead to them freezing to death. The dogs were likely brought along partially for protection from bandits and other ne'er-do-wells. In 1787, the hospice reported that the dogs fought off a band of brigands, but they quickly proved themselves adept at finding lost travelers and guiding parties through the snow-covered paths with an excellent sense of direction. They were large enough to help clear the path for the travelers with their broad chests. After an avalanche, the monks learned to send the dogs out in teams of 2 or 3. The dogs could track down buried travelers under feet of snow, and if found, either revive the traveler with their body heat and ample licking, or return to the monastery for assistance. One traveler described arriving at the hostel. In the evening, we reached the monastery of St. Bernard on the top of the mountain. Enormous sums of money were expended to build these cloisters that were made of stonework, and we placed there to give sustenance to travelers on the Alps between Italy and Switzerland. Some of the large St. Bernard dogs are about, and when we sat down, came over to give our hands a lick, just as if they wanted to say hello, too. The travelers were given medical attention, warm food, and a place to sleep before trudging up the mountain in the morning. He also described the dogs. The large dogs searched in pairs. One has a wooden keg fastened under his chin. And when they locate a victim, he is offered the wine to keep him alive, while the other dog runs back to the monastery to lead the monks who transport the lost back. Before the end of the 18th century, the rescue work of the dogs was already well known. In 1800, a dog was born at the monastery who would go on to make a famous name for himself. His name was Barry. At his adult size, Barry weighed around 40 to 45 kilograms, making him considerably smaller than the modern St. Bernard, which weighs between 65 and 85 kilograms. The same year, 40,000 soldiers traveled through the pass with Napoleon, and it was reported that not a single one died on the mountain thanks to the work of the hospice's dogs. One of the monks described them that year. They are kind to wayfarers, bark at them when far, friendly when close. We need them in particular to recognize, also through depth, traces of the old path, which would be dangerous to abandon when covered in fresh snow. Our dogs do not fear the frost. Nature have them dressed well for the climate of their environment. Incredibly, the most successful career of any of the St. Bernard's dogs was only just beginning. He apparently showed great promise even as a puppy and a zeal for the work of rescuing stranded travelers, like few other dogs did. By 1805, he was already famous throughout Europe. Perhaps his most famous rescue was of a child found senseless in an avalanche. The details about exactly who and exactly where the child was found differ in some tellings. In one, Barry was gone for hours in the storm searching and returned exhausted with the child clinging firmly to his back. While legendary and repeated in many tellings, historians believe that this tale is completely fabricated, likely first by 19th century priest, scholar, and author Peter Scheitlen. What is certainly true of Barry is that he saved many lives, and while no particular tale that has since survived is certain, he was prodigious in his ability to rescue the stranded, and saved at least 40 lives, as was reported around the time and shortly afterwards. A number that was inflated by other writers to reach as many as 100. Scheitlen wrote of the heroic dog that, "The best of dogs, the best of animals, is Barry. You used to leave the convent with a basket around your neck into the storm, in the most insidious snow. Each and every day you examined the mountain, searching for unfortunates buried under avalanches. You dug them out and brought them back to life by yourself, and when you couldn't, you rushed back to the convent, signaling the monks for help. You resurrected people." On a memorial at a pet cemetery in a suburb of Paris, a monument shows Barry carrying a boy on his back, although the dog itself doesn't much resemble the actual Barry. A plaque below it reads in French, "He saved the lives of 40 people. He was killed by the 41st. According to the story, word of a lost Swiss soldier reached the hospice, and Barry was dispatched to bring the man home. Barry picked up his scent and found the man unconscious, buried in the snow. He licked the man to wake him, but when the soldier woke, he mistook the large dog for a wolf and stabbed him with his bayonet, killing him. The tragic story, you'll be glad to know, is untrue. On the contrary, the actual story of Barry's demise is much happier. After years of loyal work, the aging dog was allowed to retire and sent to Bern, Switzerland in 1812. There he was cared for in his final years until he passed in 1814. In fact, it's a surprise that Barry would live to the age of 14. At least one report from the time said that the great St. Bernards did not live to the normal age, with about 6 to 8 years being the maximum, and that was said to be the result of humidity in their quarters, which would cause rheumatism. The dogs from the hospice seem to have struggled to maintain a breeding population. Several times in the 19th century, the population seems to have declined precipitously, only restored by crossbreeding with Newfoundlands and Great Danes, or possibly by other similar dogs from throughout the nearby valleys and passes, where they were also used. Barry was buried, but his skin was saved, and a taxidermist preserved him in a pose meant to appear meek to represent his years of service. At the time of his death, his breed had no official name. They had many different names and were called Alpine Spaniels, Alpine Mastiffs, or by locals in Switzerland, Barry dogs. The hospice kept a dog named Barry in his honor ever afterwards. Unfortunately, there's another myth about St. Bernards that is often repeated. They carried a barrel around their neck filled with alcohol, famously brandy, in the erroneous belief that brandy would warm the freezing people being rescued. There's no evidence that dogs ever actually carried anything like that, and the legend is usually traced to an 1820 painting by Edwin Landseer titled Alpine Mastiffs Reanimating a Distressed Traveler. The legend clung on so firmly that it's been repeated by almost everyone since, although the hospice itself and the historians at the museum in Bern contradict it. Ultimately, it was the breeding with dogs such as the Newfoundland which gave the dogs a longer coat and a larger bill, which ironically made it more difficult for the dogs to do their jobs, as ice would form in the long fur and drag the animals down. In 1855, one man began to try to breed back to the Barry type, and by the 1860s, St. Bernard was used primarily for the breed. In the 1880s, the Swiss Kennel Club had recognized the name as the St. Bernard, along with particular traits. Notably, the dogs had a dry mouth, and they were not known to drool. In 1923, Barry's body was refurbished, as it had become brittle and his coat had dissolved into over 20 pieces. Barry's pose was also changed, and his head was changed significantly, enlarged in a compromise between the museum owner and the taxidermist to more closely resemble the breed as it appeared then. Dogs remained at the hospice until 2004, although their job as rescue dogs had declined. There was a recorded rescue in 1897, and they may have performed some assistance in the 20th century, although other breeds and the helicopter since made their work unnecessary. A tunnel was built bypassing the pass in 1964, which means that much less traffic now passes by the hospice itself. In 2004, the dogs were sold to several foundations due to the cost of maintaining the animals, with the promise that they will still come up to the hospice during the summer. While their time as rescue animals has ended, the St. Bernard breed is still very popular today, although they don't look much like Barry or the rest of the rescue dogs of the Great St. Bernard Hospice. Over their years there, the hundreds of dogs are thought to have saved at least 2,000 lives, guarding the pass at a time when as many as 20,000 people a year braved the omnipresent snow. And many of those animals also died in those avalanches, selflessly trying to rescue those who had been stranded. Barry's taxidermied remains remain at the Natural History Museum in Bern, where they've been since his death, to remind people of his heroic nature. As an enduring symbol of that nature, the Tokyo Fire Brigade today wears a patch with an image of a St. Bernard. Peter Scheiten wrote of Barry, "Whoever should encounter your embalmed remains should take off his hat, should purchase a picture and put it in a frame and show it to his children and say, 'Go and do as well as this good Samaritan did.'" And what good advice! How much better would the world be if all we humans sought to do as much good as the best of dogs? The subject of today's episode is the only dog to have been officially enlisted in the Royal Navy. Just Nuisance was beloved by sailors in the greater Cape Town area of South Africa and bolstered the morale for countless Royal Navy personnel during the Second World War. As my viewers know, we here at The History Guy use public domain images to illustrate our videos, and there are very few pictures of Just Nuisance, and so we'll be illustrating today's episode with pictures of viewers' dogs that have been sent to us. Thank you all for helping to create this special episode, and I apologize that we received so many photographs that we won't be able to use them all in this episode. Just Nuisance, able seaman of the Royal Navy, is history that deserves to be remembered. The dog breed that is today called the Great Dane was developed in Germany from imported English dogs, crossbreeds of English Mastiffs and Irish Wolfhounds. The dogs were bred for sport. They were catch dogs. When hunting large game like boar or bear, hunting dogs would track down the beast, but the massive catch dogs would hold it until the hunters could come with spears and kill or capture it. The use led to the breed commonly be called the German Boarhound. Although the origin of the breed goes back to the 16th century, the modern breed was largely developed during the 19th century, by which time firearms had largely eliminated the need for catch dogs, and the breed was mostly kept by wealthy individuals as a hobby, a novelty because of its great size. The name most often used for the breed today actually was coined by a French naturalist in the 18th century, who chose the name Great Dane because of rising tensions between Germany and other European nations. As a breed, the Great Dane is large. While Mastiffs can be heavier, Great Danes are the tallest of the dog breeds. American Kennel Club breed standards require that a male be at least 30 inches at the shoulder, and the world record holder for tallest dog, according to Guinness, was a Great Dane named Zeus, who was 44 inches at the shoulder. They're described as a short-haired breed with a strong galloping figure that combines in its regal appearance, dignity, strength, and elegance with great size and a powerful, well-formed, smoothly muscled body. Despite their size, Great Danes are known for a friendly personality. Adam Boyko, an associate professor in biomedical sciences at the Cornell University College of Veterinary Medicine and a founder of the canine genomics and biotechnology company Embark, explains, "Great Danes are gentle giants, but this friendliness and patience is also accompanied with courage and intelligence, making them particularly adaptable and dependable companions for anyone willing to put up with their extraordinary size and strength." That description fits well with a particular Great Dane, born on April 1st, 1937, in South Africa, in the Cape Town suburb of Rondebosch. The dog had a good pedigree, and the litter was registered with the South African Kennel Union. The dog was sold as a puppy to a man named Benjamin Cheney, who had put an advertisement in a newspaper, seeking a dog to replace his previous dog, who had passed away. Even as a puppy, it was clear that the Great Dane was going to be large, even for its breed. When Cheney took him to a veterinarian to treat a sore on his tail, which wouldn't heal because the friendly puppy wagged his tail so vigorously that it kept hitting objects, the veterinarian told Cheney, "By the way, I should buy a very strong collar and chain leash. Your hound is the most magnificent physical specimen of a dog I have ever had in my surgery. He's got the heart and lungs of a horse." It was equally clear that the dog was clever. The first night he brought the dog home, Cheney gave the dog slices from a joint of lamb from the refrigerator. In the morning, when Cheney came into the kitchen, he found the joint gone from the refrigerator and the bone licked smooth as a toothbrush handle. Having only seen it once, the dog had figured out how to open the refrigerator. The dog also figured out how to open the water tap, although he learned the hard way which side was hot and which side was cold. After burning his tongue once, the dog learned to put a paw under the water first to make sure it was not too hot. The dog also apparently house-trained itself, following a practice of moving away from the house, digging a hole with its forepaws, doing its business, and then burying it by kicking the dirt back in with its rear paws. The dog would then drag his bottom for a few yards to make sure it was clean, lick all four paws clean, and come back to Cheney to offer a paw to shake. Cheney was in charge of the United Services Institute in Simonstown, which provided comforts for men in the Royal Navy, Army, and Air Force. Cheney kept the dog at work where the puppy encountered servicemen. Because Simonstown was the location of the Royal Navy base for the South Atlantic Squadron, the vast majority of the men the dog encountered were sailors, and he developed a peculiar fondness for Royal Navy sailors, especially the ratings who wore the traditional square-rigged uniform with bell-bottom trousers and a jumper with a square collar hanging over the back. The dog seemed to be friends with any man in a square-rigged uniform, but was cold towards officers and petty officers who wore the different fore and aft uniform with narrow-legged trousers and a button coat. It was downright disdainful of women, well, human women, that is. Very fond of female Great Danes. The dog followed sailors around town, although he was known not to choose favorites, and after following one sailor for hours, might then just wander off with another. It was during this time that a sailor took the dog on the train, buying a ticket for the dog to the naval yard, and took him aboard the cruiser, HMS Neptune. The sailor spoiled the dog with food, and he took to riding the train to the naval yard daily. Dogs were commonly kept as mascots, and sailors were fond of pets, but this dog, by 15 months over 150 pounds, liked to lounge on the gangplank, making it difficult for sailors to conduct business. It was this trait that prompted the sailors to give him the name Nuisance. If he had a name previous to that, it was not recorded. Nuisance was both particularly friendly, to sailors at least, and particularly intelligent, and quickly became beloved by the sailors at the base. The mess crew fed him so much food that the petty officer in charge feared that the missing food would be discovered in the ship's record. He listed the food as meat unfit for human consumption, and thus disposed of for reasons of health. Disposed of course, meant fed into Nuisance's massive maw. But there was a problem. To get to the naval yard, the dog would ride the train, something he became quite adept at. Some stories suggest that he was so intelligent that he knew the train routes and times, but he was, after all, just a dog, and most likely was simply following sailors. But railway officials were frustrated with him taking up a seat and frightening customers. They would throw him off at the first stop if he didn't have a ticket. Usually he would patiently wait on the platform and simply reboard the next train. Sailors and eventually regular commuters who grew used to seeing him would aid him in avoiding the railway conductors. Finally, officials of South African railways were fed up and informed Cheney that if he could not keep the dog off the train, they would have to put him down. Cheney, unable to guarantee the dog would not board a train, decided instead to sell him. This led to a remarkable event. Nuisance was beloved at the naval base, and the sailors made an outcry that went all the way up to the Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Navy in the South Atlantic, who used his authority as Fleet Admiral to enlist Nuisance in the Royal Navy. While there had been animal mascots aboard Royal Navy vessels for centuries, Nuisance was the first, and only, dog to be officially inducted into the Royal Navy. The Navy purchased a season pass for the railway until the enlistment could be finalized. The pass was attached to his collar. When he was enlisting, he was required to have a medical inspection. The surgeon commander found him so fit that the medical officer said if all ratings were as fit as this animal, there would be no requirement for a doctor at this depot. The enlistment paper required a first name. The petty officer at the enlistment table said he'd only ever been called Nuisance, just Nuisance. So the lieutenant during the enlistment gave his first name as Just. As Just Nuisance had, they decided, been performing his duty unofficially for 18 months before enlistment,
He did not enroll as an ordinary seaman, the lowest rank, but instead as an able seaman. His religion was listed as Canine Divinity League. His enlistment papers were signed with a paw print. All sailors in the Royal Navy were required to wear a cap when outside, so one was issued as his uniform, although he was eventually given permission to go without the cap, unprecedented for a Royal Navy sailor, as it caused him discomfort. The dog was freed from normal duty, but required to be present on parade. Special instructions were given for his liberty and feeding, and a barracks assigned where he had a regular bunk. Among the privileges of joining the Royal Navy, sailors of the Navy were allowed free travel on the train. Just Nuisance's official date of enlistment was August 25th, 1939. 9 days later, on September 3rd, Britain and its empire declared war on Germany. Just Nuisance continued to show his intelligence. He recognized God Save the King and would stand still at attention, his ears erect and his tail straight out when it was played. Likewise, when the midday cannon was fired in Simonstown, everyone was expected to be silent for 2 minutes to recognize all the sailors at sea. Just Nuisance would always observe the rule and give a low growl to any who did not. He was known for helping sailors who had over-imbibed. If he saw a sailor staggering, he would come to his side and escort him to a base or a service institution, where he usually had a regular bunk himself, watching over his charge until they awoke. If the dog saw 2 sailors fighting, he would break the fight up, pushing in between them and even standing up. He was over 2 meters tall on his hind legs, pushing them apart. The dog was gentle around children and only hostile to people who abused him. One time a drunken sailor passed out in Nuisance's bunk. The dog climbed in and pushed the man off the bed. The sailor, still drunk, tried to punch Nuisance. Nuisance reared up and pushed him on his shoulders, knocking him down. Nuisance then straddled the man, threatening him with his massive jaws. Another sailor intervened and calmed the dog down. Despite a few incidents where the dog got angry, Just Nuisance was never known to bite a man. He was beloved by sailors who at times banded together to keep the dog out of trouble. One time when he interrupted a dance at a theater, he was likely just expressing his opinion of the entertainment, the sailors present protected him from being arrested by insisting that he was chasing a rat. The sailors at the base even managed to sneak him aboard aircraft patrolling for German submarines, something he enjoyed greatly. Shop owners in the town loved the dog. He was so popular that if he decided to come into a shop, it would draw sailors from all over. They brought him so many drinks, lager was his favorite, that the base commander had to put a notice out to limit the dog to 6 quarts a night. Dr. Boyko suggests never giving a dog alcohol. Dogs are not built to tolerate alcohol, and even consuming small amounts of it can lead to life-threatening metabolic acidosis. Nuisance may have been able to tolerate alcohol only because of his large size, since larger dogs have slower metabolisms. While Nuisance could be, well, a nuisance, and was brought up on various offenses from arriving at the base late to riding the train without his pass, his military record was good. His conduct papers read, character, very good, efficiency, moderate, discipline, poor. But he was more than a distraction for sailors. One night he found a sailor on the base who had passed out from malaria and barked until someone came. The attending physician credited Nuisance with saving the man's life. An officer recalled him warning him of a dangerous scorpion and killing the arachnid. Likewise, he did the same, warning off men from a cobra and cleverly killing the snake, kicking dirt at it until it was confused and then pouncing and crushing its head. Nuisance played his role in the war effort. He accompanied the base commander to community events, raising money for the war effort. He was used in propaganda, became one of the most famous dogs in the world, and postcards of the dog were sold. He was bred, and 2 of his puppies were auctioned for the war effort. But his real role was as a friend to sailors, where his constant antics and gentle aid provided valuable distraction and comfort in a difficult time. Just Nuisance is still remembered in Simonstown, where there's a statue of him. And in 1985, his life and antics were chronicled by author Terence Sisson, who was a Navy flyer who knew and befriended Just Nuisance during the war. The book is full of anecdotes told by people who knew the dog. And the book, Just Nuisance AB, meaning able seaman, is a great read if you can still find a copy. Dr. Boyko notes that Great Danes, because of their large size, are particularly vulnerable to joint disorders like hip dysplasia. Just Nuisance, who had injured himself doing things like jumping off of moving trucks, and who had once jumped off a Royal Navy cruiser when the crew had tried to Shanghai him, swam 3 miles to shore, eventually developed paralysis of the sciatic nerve, had to be put down. He was euthanized on April 1st, 1944, his 7th birthday. The next day he was buried with full naval honors, including a bugler playing last post, and a volley followed over his grave. More than 100 sailors and men attended, a testament to their affection for their fellow seamen. Just Nuisance's descendants live on today.